Hello, everybody. I'm Phanish Puranam, professor at INSEAD, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session of the Tech Talk called Organization Designs of the Future, Lessons from DAOs. I have with me an expert team who will be joining me shortly in this conversation. And what I want to do before we get started is to make sure we follow a few rules of etiquette for this webinar. The audience is muted. The video is also off. The chat is closed. But you should feel free to use the Q&A tab to suggest questions. So I'm going to be keeping an active eye on it. And you can also, of course, upvote questions so we know which ones are most relevant for you. Please do bear in mind the webinar is going to be recorded. And if you run into any technical issues during the operation of this talk, feel free to email digital@insead.edu. For those of you who haven't participated in a tech talk before, so this is a series of talks that Digital@INSEAD has been running now for a fair amount of time, which is jointly sponsored with Accenture. And our goal is to bring together speakers at the cutting edge of applications of technology to issues in management. So as you can see from the brief list of forthcoming webinars that we put up in the beginning, we cover a variety of things like blockchain, the metaverse, AI. So we really are trying to use this forum of tech talks to bring together absolutely latest thinking in issues around technology and how they matter for how we manage and run organizations. So that's very much the spirit of today's talk as well. So today we're going to be focusing on a theme that you might call Taoism. And if you think we're going to be talking about ancient Chinese philosophy, you would be forgiven for thinking so, but we are not. What we actually are going to be talking about is the modern version, which is the philosophy and belief, if you like, that decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, will take over the world. So if you've never heard of these things before, then hopefully today you will leave at the end of this session with a much clearer understanding of what they are, why they are so important, and why so many people are so excited about what's going on in this space. Roughly speaking, there were about 1,000 of these entities called DAOs, and I'll talk a bit more about them in a second, by the end of 2021. By the end of 2022, the number had crossed 10,000, and today I think the numbers are far in excess of that. So there's a lot of ferment around this space of what are called decentralized autonomous organizations. Let me start by pointing out why I think even if you have no interest in technology or cryptocurrency or blockchain, you should still be paying attention to this phenomenon. The reason is very simple. I think these entities called DAOs are in some sense the biggest experiment in decentralization of our times, okay, of decentralized ways of organizing that we have really seen in a long time. And it's happening at a scale and a speed that is really breathtaking. So let me define these terms carefully, because sometimes people have different interpretations of the terms. So what do we mean by decentralization? And what's a decentralized organization? And why should we care if we work in a Fortune 500 company or a nonprofit or in government? What does this have to do with us? So here are a couple of very simple ideas to anchor the idea of what decentralization is all about. If you have one person in the world alone who has some objectives and goals to pursue, in some sense, life is simple, right? They just need to decide what to do, and to the best of their abilities, they can do it. But the superpower of our species is organizing, which is getting groups of people to accomplish things together. Collectively, we can do many things that individually we can't. That's organization, right? The O in DAO stands for organization. The problem, of course, is once you have a variety of people, it also means that they have a variety of perspectives. They know different things, they want different things, they may not agree. So how do you get large groups of people who may not know the same thing or want the same thing to still work effectively together to accomplish a goal? That's the basic challenge of organization, of management, if you like. And one of the most powerful solutions we've come up with is the idea of centralization, which is to have some individuals have a lot more influence and authority and power over the functioning of the system so that they can create alignment. So centralization is a powerful solution to the problem of how do you get alignment in a large group of people who want different things and know different things, and yet can collectively function in a useful manner. That's been a very standard solution for a very long time. And of course, because there are limits to how many people one central actor can manage, what in management we call the span of control problem, often we end up with multiple layers of these systems, which gives rise to what we call hierarchies. So a hierarchy is simply a centralized way with multiple layers of authority of managing large groups of people so that they collectively can get something done. Despite the fact that they don't know each other, they may want different things, they may know different things, doesn't matter. With the right degree of centralization, we can create these hierarchical systems that can achieve good outcomes. That's the logic behind every large company today. It's the logic behind how governments are structured. It's the logic behind how nonprofits are structured, for that matter. It comes with certain costs. Among the most prominent costs of these centralized hierarchical structures include the extreme dependency on the quality and the attributes of the person at the top, right? If you centralize a lot of power, obviously the quality of the person to whom you have centralized all this begins to matter a lot. So systems don't stay as robust. There's a lot of concentration of power, which could be exploited. There is potentially a fair amount of inequality across levels, which can create perceptions, genuine perhaps, of unfairness. These are costs of hierarchical structures. They can slow things down. It takes a long time for information to go from the bottom to the top. It may make decision-making happen much more slowly than it should. These are problems with hierarchies and central structures that are not new to us, right? Anybody who's a practicing manager has probably run into these issues and has thought about them. And I think we've all come to live with this uneasy truce that, yeah, hierarchy is not terrific, but maybe it's a bit like democracy. It's the worst among all forms of government, except everything else that has ever been tried. So maybe this has the same flavor that, yeah, hierarchy is not perfect, but maybe it's the best among all the bad options that we have. Now, against that context, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, represent a fairly interesting challenge to that way of thinking, saying, no, hang on. With the power of technology, we might be able to get really large numbers of people to work effectively together as an organization without becoming extremely centralized. So that's the decentralized and that's the organize in the word DAO. That leaves the word autonomous in the middle, right? What does that A in DAO stand for? And that's where technology really becomes very important, because we will hear from our speakers in a second, things like how smart contracts play an important role in DAOs, how the blockchain and cryptocurrency is often an important feature of these elements called DAOs. But what I hope you will take away from today's discussion, even if you have no interest in the technology of blockchain or cryptocurrency or smart contracts, is the more general idea that what we're seeing in these systems of DAOs is a really fascinating experiment, which is trying to answer the question, how can I organize large groups of people without centralizing them, without creating a hierarchy? With that, let me turn over to our two wonderful experts who are here with us today. Vivianna Fang He is Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at University of St. Gallen. She's been an active observer of this space for a few years now. And at St. Gallen, she directs the Institute for Responsible Innovation. She's also a collaborator of mine. We've been trying to study DAOs together. So I'm really delighted she could take the time to be with us here today. Vivianna, welcome. If you could turn your camera on now.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. I'm also very delighted to have with us Sebastian Buergel, who's the founder of HOPR Association. Sebastian is very well embedded in the DAO space and has a real practical experience of how these institutions work, and has also been a great resource for Vivianna, I know, in terms of understanding the phenomena. And we'll hear more from him as we go on today. Sebastian, welcome.
Thanks for the introduction, Phanish.
Thank you very much for being here. So before I open the floor to questions first from me and then eventually from the audience, and please remember you can use the Q&A feature at any time to put your questions in. I'm keeping an eye on them. Maybe we run a very quick poll. So Sandra, if I could request you to run a very quick online poll here. The question simply says, have you ever participated in a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, before? Options are, yes, I have actively participated in a DAO. No, I haven't. And third, not sure what a DAO is. All are perfectly legitimate answers. So let's give this 60 seconds to see what the numbers look like. Okay, we're getting close to 80% participation mark. So nice, the numbers look stable. So essentially what we have is a large chunk of people who haven't participated in a DAO yet, but are interested. And then there are two smaller fractions of people who are more knowledgeable, have been in a DAO, and some who were not really sure what this entire thing is all about. Perfect. So I think we have a wonderful conversation lined up for you. Thank you. We can stop sharing the results now. That's great. So Vivianna, I'm going to start by asking you, if that's okay with you, give us your sense of how you think about decentralized autonomous organizations. What's the definition you use in your mind and in your research?
Great. Since we talked about this before, I actually prepared a few slides. as an academic, I will feel much more comfortable talking while showing some slides. So if you allow me, I'm gonna put it up. Okay.
Sure, go for it.
Should I start with the question?
Yes.
Or maybe just a few words why I am actually joining you guys here. So as Phanish said, I am an observer of DAO. I have been studying how humans collaborate in different forms, mainly in non-hierarchical forms. So I study this type of collaboration for innovation in both startup teams and then open source communities. As I study the open source communities, most of them live in GitHub. I noticed this new breed quite a few years back, the communities around Bitcoin, for example, or part of the Ethereum project. They all started as an open source project, and then they grew into a distinct form. What I noticed in common in all these different forms of collaboration is that they rely to a lesser degree on hierarchy. And if we place them on a continuum, we can see that DAOs actually is relying to the least extent on hierarchy. That makes them really unique and interesting for organization scholars. And another connection of myself and DAO is that, so Phanish and I, together with Akansha, we have started a Mirror DAO. So we try to study decentralized governance by governing a decentralized community interested in this topic. So this is our small experiment. If you are interested in knowing more about this DAO, please feel free to get in touch with us. Now, getting back to your question, Phanish, what's the definition of DAO? This is something that's really difficult to define. And we have seen that different scholars have tried various approaches to understand it, to define it. So maybe instead of defining it, let me just talk about what these three words actually mean. Like, this is according to my perspective. So let's first look at decentralized. And in these organizations, governance really relies on decentralized protocols instead of a central authority or a managerial hierarchy. Later, I'm also going to show you what a decentralized protocol is like. Then moving on to autonomous. So here, rules are encoded in smart contracts on a blockchain, which provides the infrastructure for decision-making. Voting is on-chain. At least the final step is on-chain. Then in terms of organization, yes, this is an organization. It is a group of individuals who hold the native tokens and then make decisions regarding both the governance and the operation of this organization. So this is my understanding of what these three words really mean in this context. I don't know whether, Sebastian, you agree with my definition because you are actually running one. So I'm just going to stop here and see what you think.
Thank you, Vivianna. I'm going to come to Sebastian in 1 second, if that's okay, Sebastian, because I had another question follow on to Vivianna, which is, how do you think these are different from online communities? And how do you think they're different from, let's say, a country club, right? In some sense, both of these are also decentralized systems. And while you answer them, would it be okay if you put the Mirror DAO slide back on? I have some questions in the Q&A saying, give us the QR code again.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you could leave that on and then maybe reflect quickly on these two questions I just raised.
So how is it different from an online community? I'm most familiar. So there are different types of online communities. Since I'm most familiar with the open source, I'm going to take that as an example. Actually, I also have a slide about the Bitcoin Collective. I think this will be a good example to show you what's the difference or commonalities between an open source community and a DAO as we know it. So the Bitcoin Collective, this is probably one of the largest collective in the space of DAO. If you look at it, you see there are more than 1 million miners, more than 100 million users. Then in terms of the core developers of the Bitcoin software, which is open source software, on the bitcoin.org, we can count 350 regular contributors. There are more, but they are not listed there perhaps. as you can see that a typical open source community, we are really just talking about the developers and people who are interested in contributing. But in the Bitcoin Collective, we have many different types of stakeholders and groups. We have also the entrepreneurs, people who build business in this ecosystem. And then a subset of them are the DAO members. Remember what we talk about, the members of DAO are the holders of token, the native token, and these people also participate in the decision making. So it's token-based decision making. So a subset of this huge collective is the Bitcoin DAO member, if we take it as a DAO. So this is just the difference in terms of the membership base. But if we go back to talk about more general difference between this open source community and DAO, we can also try to understand how is this different organization governed. So in terms of governance, the traditional open source community is a norm-based governance. There are bylaws and then the norms that community members abide to. In a DAO, there is also a strong all-week norm. But more importantly, the governance is technology-based. It is, the rules are coded, and the rules are coded in a form of smart contract in their own chain. Then in terms of legal status, this comes to a very interesting discussion, the emerging discussion. DAOs nowadays can come to have different legal status and also depends on different regulatory regime. It can be considered a partnership based on how they distribute returns. It can also be a blockchain-based limited liability company. This is a new phenomenon starting from the state of Vermont. But we know the online communities, the open source communities, they don't really have a clear legal status. So these are just a few things. This is not an exhaustive list, but the starting point for us to understand the differences.
Thank you. Well, I think Sebastian is just trying to rejoin because he had some technical issue. But I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions that came up for you in the Q&A, Vivianna. Maybe you could answer those in the meantime. So one question, and maybe just leave Mirror DAO up there. Yeah, thank you. That's great. So one question people asked is, what's the status of the original token owners in the Bitcoin community that you showed? How are they different or similar to other members in the ecology?
You mean the token holders, how are they different from
the other members of the community, the users, let's say? So what's the difference there?
There is an overlap between the token holders and users. Many users are also token. Actually, I think all the users are token holders. So this, if we show it in a Venn diagram, perhaps it's easier to understand. But different groups can hold tokens. It's not like everybody in each group holds tokens.
Got it. Thank you. Sebastian, welcome. So I hope you can hear and see as well. Let me just check this out. So Sebastian, tell us a bit more about your engagement in this community and also about HOPR Association.
Yeah, gladly. I hope you hear me okay. So I've been working in the crypto field since mid-2015. When the Ethereum blockchain launched, which in contrast to Bitcoin that Vivianna mentioned, the ability to run arbitrary code on a blockchain. And what that allows for the very first time in me was really the ability to not just run financial experimentation of issuing money, but of organizations, for example, on chain. So there was a very, very early one called the DAO, the biggest crowdfunding experiment of all time that spectacularly failed. So that was something interesting that I was really directly involved in. Afterwards, in the next year, I've been involved in the first attempt here in Switzerland to digitize a Swiss organization, a Swiss association actually, as this one of the simplest forms of legal in Switzerland, and learned that also that was pretty tough. So at HOPR, I'm now working on privacy infrastructure. So HOPR is a privacy protocol that seeks to provide a more private version to transfer data from A to B in your centralized VPN providers. And how to do that, of course, in the spirit of Web3 by a decentralized network of stakeholders operate the networks. So effectively, HOPR is an organization that provides free and open source software, but is not running the show, right? And that is already, I'm missing out to the DAO aspect, is giving up control, is relying on a community of others who are not just volunteers, but who are incentivized to play a vital role of running infrastructure in the decentralized network. And to govern that, we have indeed a governance system that involves the HOPR token, which is the HOPR DAO. So that is my connection to DAOs in this field.
Thank you, Sebastian. Your sound cuts in a little bit in and out. So if there's a way to improve it, you could do. I will use the time in the meantime to pick up on a couple of questions along with Vivianna. So I think one way to help the broader community understand what's so exciting about this is maybe focus for a second on the non-technology aspect, and then we'll come back to the technology stuff with Sebastian. So how do you get a large group of people to agree on anything? This seems like such a difficult problem in any context, not just in DAOs. So what's the secret sauce in the case of DAOs? How do they actually get a huge community? You said something like 1 million+ people in the case of Bitcoin. How do they agree?
So in my eyes, it is really having a commonality of what we want to achieve. And sometimes I say the DAOs have both kind of the properties of a church, of a soccer club. And it really is both, like it's rallying support of a large number of people who are working towards a common goal. And that is a pretty big contribution to this craziness and commitment of people who don't know each other to work. But the other one is, and that is more the properties of the club sometimes, it is having effectively an incentive layer, having common financial asset that people are sharing, that unites their view on where we are going. And it is really something which is underappreciated when we compare DAOs, shareholder corporations. It is really an online community of people who want the same thing. I mean, sometimes they have different opinions, obviously, but they largely align around a similar goal. And that is extremely powerful and extremely dynamic, opposed to shareholder corporation with maybe once or twice a year having a shareholder assembly.
So Sebastian, I'm going to ask Vivianna to also respond to the same question. In the meantime, could you possibly log off and join back in, because your sound quality is not great. So there's some issue with the connectivity. Vivianna, over to you.
This is a great question. How do we build consensus in a large population? Although I'm Chinese, I think I'm not the best Chinese to answer this question. If you ask the Chinese government, I'm sure they have great lessons to share. How do you make a huge nation seemingly agree on how to run certain things? I think it comes down to two basic properties. How do you make a large group of people want the same thing and know the same thing? I think Sebastian mentioned the goal alignment, and DAOs have some DAOs have a very effective mechanism to align the goals of the participants in this collective. Take Bitcoin, for example. This is a collective that largely united under the principle of number goes up, like number go up, right? If the huge group of people all share this goal to see the prosperity of the cryptocurrency, this is a very good alignment mechanism. But And Sebastian also mentioned that even if you want the same thing, you might have different approaches to achieve the shared goal. And the second mechanism is to make the huge group of people know the same thing. Here, there are both the technological solutions and then the cultural solutions. The technological solution is easy. In the blockchain, everybody can download the same piece of truth. So the transaction record or all the codes are transparent. And if you have access to this public ledger, to the network, everybody has access to the same piece of truth or knowledge. So they know the same thing. And the second mechanism is the culture or the community know I mentioned. Since this DAOs is a porous organization, so the border is open, and people select themselves into different DAOs based on the value. And so that mechanism also ensures there is very high alignment and like the subscription to certain cultural norms. And cultural norms also, it is a way to propagate certain ways to interpret current events and history. So that in addition to the shared knowledge also create a very similar world model among the participants. So through these mechanisms, they know or interpret the world in very similar way. So that's a insurance under they could come to share different approach to pursue a shared goal.
Thank you. So I do want to underline that point because I think what you said there is super important. If you want to run a large group of people in a decentralized way and still get them to agree on stuff, to a large extent, what Vivianna is saying is you need to make sure their values are already aligned. And that can happen partly by attracting the right set of people whose values are aligned. And it can partly happen, I guess, by socialization once they join, which is through the information sharing systems and the online chat forums and the frequent deliberation, right? So it's got to be managed. It can't be taken for granted. And that's actually a very large analog component of managing these DAOs, which has not to do with technology. It has more to do with traditional management. Right? And that's also the reason why it might be relevant for traditional management organizations as well. So I think it's a really important point that you raised. Sebastian, do you want to give it a try? Let's see how your technology and the connection sounds like now.
Yeah, so sorry for the technical issues on my end.
Yeah, I don't know if it's working very well still, Sebastian. Maybe what we do is I will funnel you questions. You can stay on video. Would it be okay if you put your answer in chat? Because your audio is bad, but your video is okay. Yeah, let's do it like that. Okay. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions I'm seeing in Q&A, which are now getting upvoted so we can kind of see how to respond to them. So Sebastian, if you could also respond on chat, and Vivianna and I'll try to take it on audio. So one question that comes up is DAO an organizational form, or is it a blockchain-based ecosystem? That's the question. Is it an organizational form really, or should we think about it as a blockchain-based ecosystem? You want to take a shot at it, Vivianna?
That's a good question. There's a nesting relationship here, I think. The blockchain-related ecosystem, the larger ecosystem involves both DAO members who are the token holders and a larger group of people who have interest in the DAO or have built business on that, but who do not necessarily hold a native token.
Okay. So at least from my perspective, I think of it as it's really both in the sense ecosystems are also a kind of organization, right? In the sense it's a collection of multiple actors who are trying to achieve some goal. They may not all belong to one firm. So in my mind, at least the distinction between a firm and an organization should be maintained, because firms are just a kind of organization. There are other kinds, right? There are non-profit organizations, there are governments, there are communities. These are also organizations. So in that sense, it is a particular kind of organization which relies on this blockchain as a technology to essentially create the both the record of transactions as well as to be the underlying layer for the currency in which economic value is exchanged. Another interesting question around governance, which is if so much of what happens in DAOs is driven by people agreeing through voting, how do you make sure people actually vote? Isn't there voter fatigue? So don't people get tired and bored of voting on everything? I mean, imagine running your team in your company where you wake up on Monday and you run a vote, and then you wake up on Tuesday, run another vote, and maybe you run a couple of votes during the day. Employees will revolt, no? So how do people overcome these voting fatigue issues in DAOs?
I think this one, Sebastian must have amazing insight, because he has been running different experiments and trying different approaches to incentivize voting and participation in his community.
Sebastian, do you want to try the audio for a bit? If it doesn't work, then we're going to ask you to do it by chat, if that's okay. But give the audio a quick try if you can. Yeah, I'm not sure Sebastian is able to connect. I think he's having some severe technology issues. Are you familiar with what they do in HOPR, Vivianna? Would you be able to say something on what they do?
Yes, since I happen to be taking HOPR as a case study, so I know a little bit about HOPR. Sebastian and his team has been running different experiments, varying the way they incentivize voting. Also varying the voting mechanism. For those who are not familiar with voting mechanism, think about it as like how much weight one vote one can have. It's one person, one vote, or one token, one vote, and there are different ways, quadratic voting, so different ways of using weights. So they are trying to see whether voting mechanism has any impact on how people participate in decision-making and the voting behavior or percentage of members vote. And a different way to think about how do you incentivize people to vote is to really have them, to make them have a stake in the things that are discussed, right? In traditional corporate settings, you can see that this is done through ownership. Some people have a share of the cake, and others are employees, they are paid by wage. Obviously, those who have ownership in the firm are much more motivated in participating and devoting a large chunk of time in thinking about the decisions. In DAOs, the interesting thing is everybody has a share. Through holding the tokens, everybody is the owner. So I think this is a key difference between DAOs and the corporations. It's the what we call the minority shareholders and their voice. And I think ownership is a strong incentive for people to participate.
Got it. So that can be essentially a way of getting people to participate. But I guess also it goes back to your point you raised earlier, that you're selecting into these communities people who actually put a lot of value on having a continuous consultation of their views and their opinions, right? So it's part of the deal, I guess, when they sign up. You're joining this in part because you value that participative style of ongoing engagement and being consulted and having a voice. So you may not see the voting requirement as a burden, but more as a responsibility. At least that's the ideal case scenario, I guess.
That's the ideal case. In reality, I think Sebastian have a lot to tell us.
Okay, I think he looks like he has a more stable connection now. Sebastian, the question was, how do you manage voter fatigue?
Yeah, it is. First of all, it is a big issue that we see. Like there have been some pretty dramatic examples. For example, in Uniswap, one of the biggest decentralized exchanges, that kind of pushed through a decision to allocate several $1 million worth of funding, and in the end, it was something on the order of like 5 people who actually deliberated on the topic, which in the end appeared on Twitter, and people were like, "Okay, what the hell actually went down there?" So yeah, first of all, it is a big issue, and I see fundamentally 2 approaches. One is delegation. So what I start seeing emerging in the DAO ecosystem is what I would summarize as protocol politicians. We see people who volunteer to represent others and kind of, usually similar to politicians in the established world, have their views outlined before. What we are trying, experimenting explicitly with maximally decentralized DAOs, is incentivize useful participation. So yeah, that's difficult. You shouldn't.
Oh goodness, I think we've lost Sebastian again. Rich, are you on the call? If you can join, maybe it's okay for you to continue from where Sebastian dropped off. And maybe you could introduce yourself briefly as well.
Hi, I'm not sure if you can see me. I'll just talk while I try and work out my video settings. I wasn't expecting to join this in this capacity. I'm Rich. I'm the governance designer at HOPR, and I've overseen most of the experiments that Vivianna mentioned. We have seen very strong participation in the HOPR DAO for the reasons that Vivianna mentioned. You know, most people have a stake in the project and so are incentivized to participate. We've also found that participating voting itself doesn't produce the kind of deleterious effects you might expect. There's a lot of intuition that introducing incentives to voting and governance produces sort of bad or somehow unseemly motivations, but we found that actually it's with good incentive design, it just acts as an encouragement for people to participate rather than necessarily just trying to acquire the incentives and not actually participate in the interests of the project or the governance. That being said, obviously it isn't a good idea to ask everyone to vote on everything. People won't want to do that, and also it slows down. It produces a very undynamic system in terms of getting stuff actually done and decisions made. We're still working on good ways to streamline the process so that decisions could be made dynamically. Delegation is a good option, and sort of delegation of power seems like a good option. You know, the community votes to assign someone a role, and then that person is just empowered to do that role without further input from the community unless they decide to revoke that permission. That seems like it might be a good option. Another thing that we've seen is that a way to encourage participants who might have different levels of enthusiasm is to just have a process that allows people to participate in different ways. The HOPR system, you know, you can, if you are very strongly engaged and you have a lot of knowledge, you can participate a lot in the initial discussion period, and then there is a sort of a follow-up period where people who maybe just want the high-level overview and want to make a decision get to vote on which proposals they support, and then those proposals go to the vote, and then there's a third opportunity to participate. So this allows people who maybe have different stakes and different amounts of time and effort that and knowledge they might want to contribute to still participate up to the level that they're comfortable with, rather than just locking things out so it's only the most highly knowledgeable and engaged people that can say anything. This has worked quite well for the proposals we have at the moment, which are all quite easy to understand natural language proposals. You get problems when these proposals are more technical and involve, you know, smart contracts, and, you know, people having to understand even what the proposal means becomes a problem. But there are some quite interesting work being done in crypto and Web3 at the moment to make those proposals more understandable for, you know, regular participants. But this is important work because, as has been seen in some recent governance attacks, there are problems that emerge when the proposal, as stated, does not actually match what it's going to do. We saw this in the tornado attack. So this is something that needs to be overcome to make sure that people can participate fully, despite perhaps differences in technical ability.
Thank you, Rich. I want to underline 2 points to what you said, and I think Vivianna wants to talk through this slide as well. The 2 points I want to underline is maybe the benchmark for successful voting is not 100% participation. It's actually 100% opportunity to participate, and people might then self-select in or out depending on the issue, right? That's really a big part of it. The other is that there's nothing incompatible between the idea of decentralized governance and voting-based decision-making and fairly centralized execution. So we might all collectively deliberate and talk and decide and make a vote, but in the end, we make a decision on what happens, and the execution could then be delegated to one actor or a small set of people, which is no different from the way it happens in, for instance, a corporate legal entity or in a government context, right? So when we hear the word decentralization in DAO, we might be triggered to think of really extreme forms where literally every person weighs in on everything. And maybe that's an ideal, but the reality, as you can clearly hear from both Rich and Sebastian, is a bit more nuanced. It's really more about which parts are decentralized and which parts are not. And here there are some really interesting ideas to learn from this context. Vivianna, you wanted to talk about this slide?
I put this slide out just to underline Rich's point. I think Rich's core message is to battle this voter fatigue. It's not just to incentivize voting, but to incentivize high quality deliberation. And so it's very important to have decentralized process. So it's important to have a large pool of people contribute to this early stage to deliberate on the topic. And then down the line, as you mentioned, it could be at the end, there's only a small group of people that represent a synthesized opinion from the community. And that still is a decentralized process because that synthesizes the larger group of people's interests and opinions. Here, I think the pitfall is to only incentivize voting. Then you will have large group of people vote, but the topic is not thoroughly discussed and evaluated. And also, one point you mentioned is very interesting is you can have decentralized deliberation and voting and then a centralized execution. I think that's to some extent the situation at HOPR because most of the decisions that are made through this process are eventually implemented by the founding team, the HOPR Association. So they are taking the larger community's input, but then have a more centralized way of implementing some of the decisions.
Thank you. There's one factual question, which is about, do you know examples of commercial DAO organizations? So I'm sure between the three of you, you know many. Would you just put them in the text chat maybe? Because I'm not sure that's worth actually spelling out word by word. But if you could put examples in the chat, that would be terrific. Both you, Sebastian, Rich, and Vivianna as well. I want to move on to another question that got upvoted quite a bit. It seems DAO appeared to work on the concept of wisdom of crowds. Okay? And is that really true? Is the crowd in aggregate somehow wiser than individual decision-making as we see in centralized systems? When is that true? When is that not? So before I turn it to you, I do want to point out what we know from the literature on wisdom of crowds. So this is, of course, the phrase popularized by Surovicki, right? The book called Wisdom of Crowds. And it starts with this very nice story about people trying to estimate the weight of a cow in some market fair in England in the 1870s or something. And it turns out that the crowd on average comes quite close to estimating the true weight of this cow or buffalo, whatever animal it was. Now, there are a couple of things in that story that people usually get wrong. Okay, and I want to make sure that we know what those are. First, there is no theorem whatsoever on the planet that tells us that the crowd will be better than the best person in the crowd. In other words, the crowd in average is not guaranteed to be better than the wisest individual in the crowd. Okay, this doesn't follow. Second, it's also not guaranteed that the crowd will actually converge on the true answer. Okay, neither of these statements are true. In the particular example that Surovicki writes about with the wisdom of crowds, I think the second is true. It's not generally true. So firstly, the wisdom of the crowds is not as powerful as people sometimes think. All it provides is a very powerful way of aggregating information, which turns out to be helpful when people are wrong in canceling ways. Right? So if you shoot too far to the left, I shoot too far to the right, we average, we get it right. So that kind of error cancellation is what crowds do well. But beyond that, we don't really have any reason to think crowds are in aggregate somehow more wise or more far-seeing or omniscient. So with that as a starting point, I just want to invite Sebastian and Rich to reflect on this. How do they think about the collective wisdom of their community versus that of really experienced individuals? How do you balance this?
I don't know if you see me again.
Yeah, we do.
Hear me again? Okay, great. It is indeed helpful to have specialists on the job for specific tasks, but we do see some decisions where crowds are having actually good insights. So, for example, for decisions on how to disperse certain funds in the community, might have specific insights that a expert in a rapidly growing field does not have. So some wisdom of the crowds is good, And yeah, we do see as helpful from an engaged community.
Vivianna, do you want to add to that, or Rich, either of you?
Yes, I mean, I would say that in thinking about designing governance, I try to separate the two questions of, as you put it, like providing the opportunity to as many people as possible to participate and actually reaching good decisions. I don't think it's necessarily the job of the governance design to produce the best decisions. I think the primary goal should be to enable participation, and then you build systems on top that will actually lead to good decision making, and maybe those are sort of cultural and self-selection. And then, maybe, if the values of your DAO are that you're just going to be purely democratic, then that trumps making a good decision. If everyone does converge on what turns out to be a bad decision, the governance platform has still done its job to reach that. I have looked into some sort of interesting research around sort of aggregating wisdom of the crowd type questions and seeing how they fare against like prediction markets and such. And those results are interesting and something that I guess decentralized governance is going to want to leverage in the future. But I think the first step to that is just making sure that you are even accessing the entire crowd and not cutting out important voices that are going to skew that. And then you decide if you want to actually act on that decision that's been made.
That's interesting. So actually explicitly thinking about participation and accuracy as two different criteria, which hopefully are correlated, but not necessarily perfect. Right? That's a very important way to think about it.
And let's not take DAO as a panacea. It is a useful way of organizing to solve certain problems. But if you want to solve a math problem, I don't think you need a DAO to do that, right?
Yeah, no, that's very true. That said, I think that the miraculous aspect of this needs to be highlighted, right? We're talking about thousands, maybe up to 1 million in some examples, as Vivianna said, of people who don't know each other, don't interact except online, right? There is no face-to-face communication in most of these systems. So it's mostly text chat. So when she says deliberation here, she really means people writing text messages to each other. Such a system to be able to accomplish anything, and that too without a strong hierarchical structure, is kind of a miracle of sorts, right? So that's the thing that we are really excited about and are trying to understand how much of that can generalize. Another question that came up with many upvotes is from Jules Ratcliffe. The question is, how do you square the circle of token holders as DAO participants receiving some economic benefit without making those tokens a security? Is the question clear? Yeah.
I think that's a tricky one that especially currently, many people are trying to answer, having an antagonist that happens to reside especially in the United States of America, which is making it very difficult, because what has been a perceived answer so far seems to no longer hold in all cases. So yes, it's difficult. So what people are typically trying to avoid the security trap is obviously all nuances of a token that could make you fall for the Howey test. So specifically, that means you do not share revenues. And in some examples, that goes to absurd lengths, to products which are very profitable, which have actually sustainable revenue, which cannot be distributed in any way because people are afraid of Gary Gensler and the SEC in the United States. But being very mindful of, without going into too much depth, of this Howey test and distributing rewards in what could be perceived common enterprise is one thing. And there's really very, I would just end it on saying there's really very active research, both from the organizational science as well as from the legal side, into how we can actually achieve that. Like, we do not just want to build shareholder corporations which are digital. We're trying to build something which is much more native in the digital world.
Without oversimplifying it, the test is, when you purchase a token, do you expect to get interest from your purchase? So the opposite of having an interest is when you purchase a piece of gold, you don't expect any interest. However, over time, this piece of gold could gain higher value, but this is not security, but it's a property that just increases value over time.
So one question I see in slightly different wording, that's why I didn't get quoted collectively. The question is basically, I guess, from people not very familiar with DAOs saying, show me something a DAO built. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. So, but the question really is, point me to some economic product or some service that I know exists in the world, which is built by a DAO. Because I'm still not able to get a sense of what do these things tangibly do. So could you give us some examples?
Yeah, I mean, so one problem here is that these DAOs are pretty active in the Web3 space, right? And show me one example of a product in the Web3 space that you're using on a day-to-day basis. Well, probably that answer is you're not using any, right? So that's the problem. I gave an example before. So there are venture DAOs. In fact, the DAO, something that I mentioned in the beginning, which unfortunately failed due to some technical limitations, was also a venture DAO. So it's kind of different people coming together and collectively making investment decisions, typically in venture. So the one that I would point to is Metacartel Ventures, but there's a bunch of others, which are effectively investment clubs of people that have very clear rules and instructions of how they operate and make decisions collectively together. And obviously, one that I have to point out is HOPR. So if you're interested in privacy, you can check out what we're building and how that is being done. I will highlight one kind of interesting intersection here, something that has recently been voted on, which is an investment in a real-world entity. So DAOs, which typically live purely in cyberspace, can, by means of having a legal body that is connected to this cyberspace organization, very well invest in real world assets. And in this case, it was shares in a Swiss-based share corporation.
Perhaps I could also elaborate on that. There are 3 types of products a DAO can build. The first one, I would take HOPR as an example. The first one is about some product as an infrastructure for the Web3 space. HOPR provides a really good solution to privacy. So this is a privacy infrastructure in the Web3 space. And the second type, it is a solution or for either a social good or a solution to a commercial problem that's Web3 based. And the third one is the one we are most familiar with is a DeFi product. It can be a cryptocurrency, it can be any decentralized financial product that's used in the cyberspace. Yeah, there are a lot of different tokens, stablecoin, or yeah, just those various coins used in the Web3.
Yeah, actually, let me give some example, which I really think is fascinating, and I think yeah, the first DAO that we've seen operationally active is called MakerDAO. And Maker is offering a US dollar stable token that is backed by collateral. And it's backed by collateral to the tune of several $1 billion. And yeah, this collateral is, for example, Ether, which is obviously a very volatile asset. So, there's a bunch of decisions which have to be taken, which are economically really, really demanding. And very sophisticated risk models have been developed for it. And now we see kind of a variety of underlying assets which are voted upon by a DAO, by risk parameters for these assets, such as collateralization ratio in MakerDAO, that are being deliberated and voted on by the community. So since I know there's several people in this community here interested in financial applications, I do encourage everyone to check out MakerDAO and engage in their forum. There's really, extremely cutting edge research being done in production mode, in the public.
Okay, as we are winding close to the hour here, I want to do a quick rapid fire round, if I may, with a couple of questions aimed at both of you. So Vivianna, in particular, I know you also wear the hat of being an entrepreneurship professor. So what can entrepreneurs learn about scaling their ventures from the DAO world? Because some of these things have scaled really fast, right? So what can one learn to build a large scale venture or scale a venture rapidly that the DAOs do that other corporations don't?
I think the question, the answer to this question has two forks. I think first you need to understand your own business. If you can take a DAO approach to scale it, because we see that the DAO governance, a lot of rules are coded as a smart contract and on blockchain. The first question you need to ask is whether important aspects of your business and governance can actually be coded if these are codifiable. And so that already, depending on your answer, that already can determine whether you want to look for a solution in the DAO space. And then next, I will answer in a more general way. Is earlier we talked about two ways to build consensus. First is to make people want the same thing, and then second, make people know the same thing. These two principles are more generalizable for startups. So the value alignment, when you scale in your new hires, you need to pay special attention to that. In the flux of newcomers, pay attention to retain that high value alignment as you started your business in a smaller scale. And then the second one, in terms of wanting the same thing, is you need to have an effective mechanism to facilitate knowledge sharing in the way that you can be sure that, or this is also a tricky question, and the balance between diversity and then this heterogeneity and in how you approach a problem. So this is a tricky balance. I'm not sure if I have a good question to this, a good answer to this question.
But at least they're struggling with the same question in some sense in both the entrepreneurship world and the DAO world. Sebastian, similar question for you. What do you think large corporations should learn about how they run themselves from the DAO world? Besides, anything to add to what Vivianna said?
Yeah, I would just say that very agile structures of purely weird online cyberspace communities can be constructive. I think that's a challenge to accept, but yeah, that would be my answer.
At least experiment with some of it, some parts of the place. So I will close by saying that for me as an organizational scientist, what I find really fascinating about this is it really represents an attempt to get large-scale consensus going among strangers. In some sense, all organizational designs are meant to solve that problem, and they rely heavily on centralization. DAOs are trying to do it differently. The jury is out. Have they succeeded? We don't know. Some are, many are not. Some are still struggling with the mechanics of voting. But it is an absolutely fascinating experiment from which we can all learn. And hopefully we'll come back to another session of this in some time to see how the community has moved on and what new insights we can gather from them. I want to thank Vivianna, Sebastian, and Rich as well for jumping in and helping answer questions here. We couldn't address every question in the Q&A, but we tried to get most of them, hopefully. And I hope there will be ways to continue this conversation through channels that our friends at INSEAD Digital will set up for us. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.